I used to think that once you died, you would finally be free from all the whispers, the rumors, the cruel glances, and the pain that had once haunted you in life. I thought death was silence, a soft curtain falling over the noise of human cruelty. But I was wrong. Because when I left this world at the age of 45, I did not find silence. Instead, I found myself standing at the back of a crowded church, staring at the white coffin that held my body, and hearing, clear as if it were thunder, people gossiping about me, about my life, about my marriage, about the mistress who had dared to show her face at my funeral. It was supposed to be a day of mourning, a day where my children were comforted, where my memory was honored. But instead, it became a stage for betrayal, to breathe freely, no longer hidden in shadows. I watched my friends, my family, my neighbors, all dressed in black, lean close to one another, their voices hushed but sharp. "Do you see her? That's her. That's the mistress. Can you believe she came here?" The words stung, and though I no longer had a beating heart, I swear it ached in my chest. Let me take you back. My name was Evelyn. I was a woman of simple beginnings, raised in a small town where people knew each other's names and secrets, but still pretended not to. I was the eldest daughter of 3 siblings, and from the moment I could carry responsibility, I did. My parents relied on me to help raise my younger brother and sister. I learned early on that a woman's worth was measured in how much she could sacrifice without breaking. And so, when I married my husband, Thomas, at 22, I carried that same lesson into our life together. Thomas was handsome in a steady, almost unremarkable way. He wasn't the type of man who stole breaths when he entered a room, but he had a warmth, a quiet strength that made you feel safe. At least that was what I thought in the beginning. He told me I was his world, that he would build a life where I never had to feel small, never had to feel alone. I believed him. How could I not? I was young, in love, and desperate to belong to someone who swore they saw me fully. The first years of our marriage were good, ordinary, maybe even happy. We bought a modest house, built routines around shared meals, and soon welcomed 2 children into the world, Clara and Michael. My life revolved around them. I gave up my dreams of becoming a teacher, telling myself that one day, when the children were older, I would return to it. But that day never came. Motherhood became my identity, my duty, and my invisible chain. It wasn't until much later that I began to feel the cracks forming. At first, they were small things. Thomas working late more often, his smile turning distant, his body present but his soul elsewhere. I tried to convince myself it was work stress, that he was just tired. But then came the lies. Subtle at first, then blatant. Business trips that didn't match the receipts I found in his pockets. Perfume lingering on his shirts that wasn't mine. The way he avoided my eyes when I asked about his day. I confronted him once, trembling with both fear and anger, asking if there was someone else. He looked at me with such practiced indignation, swore on his mother's grave that there wasn't, that I was imagining things, letting paranoia rot my mind. And like a fool, I wanted so badly to believe him that I silenced myself. I buried my doubts. I smiled at dinner tables, hosted birthday parties, tucked my children into bed at night as if nothing was wrong. I became a master at hiding my wounds, even from myself. But truth has a way of seeping out, like water through cracked stone. I caught glimpses of her before I knew her name. A woman with dark hair and lips always painted red, who seemed to hover at the edges of Thomas's world. I remember the first time I saw them together, outside a restaurant in the city. His hand lingered on her back too long, his eyes soft in a way I hadn't seen in years. My stomach twisted, and for a moment I thought I might collapse on the sidewalk. But I walked on, pretending not to notice, because acknowledging it would mean admitting my whole life had been built on a lie. Years passed like this, me pretending not to see, him pretending I didn't know. I hated myself for staying. But I stayed anyway. For Clara, for Michael, for the illusion of family. I told myself children needed both parents, even if one of them was a coward and the other a silent martyr. When the illness came, I was already tired. Cancer doesn't care if you've already been hollowed out by betrayal. It takes and takes until there's nothing left. Thomas was there, at least in the beginning. He sat through the appointments, held my hand during chemotherapy, but I could feel the distance even then. His heart wasn't with me, it was elsewhere, with her. The woman who waited for him while I fought for my life. I died quietly, my children at my side, their tears soaking my hands. Thomas kissed my forehead and told me he loved me. I wanted to believe him in that last moment, wanted to pretend his words weren't laced with the bitter aftertaste of lies. I closed my eyes with that ache inside me, thinking maybe, just maybe, death would finally let me rest. But death is crueler than I thought, because at my funeral, I saw her walk in. The mistress. The woman who had stolen my husband's heart while I wasted away. She wore black, of course, her hair pinned neatly, her veil delicate, as if she had earned the right to grieve me. People gasped, whispered, pointed. That's her. That's the woman. Can you believe she's here? And Thomas, oh God, Thomas didn't send her away. He looked at her, and in that fleeting glance was all the truth I had tried to bury for years. I stood there, invisible among the mourners, and felt rage like I'd never known. To see her sitting there as my children wept, as my friends whispered, as my memory was reduced to gossip, it was unbearable. My dignity was torn from me even in death. The betrayal that had haunted me in life followed me into the grave. The whispers spread like wildfire. How long do you think it went on? She must have known. Poor Evelyn. I wanted to scream at them, to tell them I had known, that I had carried that secret alone for years, that I had stayed silent not because I was weak, but because I was trying to protect the very children who now sat in front of my coffin, confused and broken. But the dead have no voice. All I could do was listen, as my life was dissected in hushed tones. I watched my daughter Clara, her face pale with shock as she glanced at the woman. She was old enough to understand, to piece together the puzzle, and my son Michael, his jaw clenched, his fists tight at his sides. They would remember this day, not only as the day they lost their mother, but as the day they learned their father's betrayal was real. In that moment, I realized something cruel but true. Secrets don't stay buried. They find their way to the surface, no matter how hard you try to smother them, and though it shattered me to see it all unfold this way. Perhaps it was a kind of justice. Perhaps my silence had been too heavy, my sacrifices too blind. Maybe death had forced the truth into the open, tearing away the mask Thomas had worn for so long. Still, justice doesn't feel like victory. It feels like ashes on the tongue. Because I loved him once. Because I gave my life to him only to have it end in humiliation. And yet, even in death, I cannot let go. My story does not end in silence. It begins here, in the whispers at my funeral, where betrayal was finally named out loud. The whispers that curled through the air of my funeral burned hotter than any fire I had ever known. They weren't just words. They were knives dressed in silken voices, cutting into the fabric of my memory. How shameless, someone muttered, eyes darting toward the woman draped in black who sat a few rows behind my grieving children. Another leaned in closer, lowering her voice, but I heard her as though she had shouted it. She shouldn't be here. Not today, not at Evelyn's funeral. And yet, there she was, sitting among them, her spine straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The audacity of her presence made my blood boil, even in death. I wanted to rise from the coffin, to scream, to drag her out by her perfectly manicured hands and ask her how she dared to cry for a man she never had the right to love. But instead, I stood invisible, forced to watch as my life unraveled in whispers, as dignity I had fought so hard to preserve slipped like sand through grasping fingers. I couldn't stop staring at Thomas. His face was carved into grief, or what looked like grief. He dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief, nodded blankly at those who offered condolences. But every so often, his gaze strayed, just briefly, toward her, toward the mistress. That one glance told me everything I had tried not to admit in life. He wasn't just mourning me. He was tethered to her even here, at the altar of my final goodbye.
Do you know what betrayal feels like when you've already died? It's worse. Because in life, betrayal at least pushes you toward action, toward confrontation, or escape, or despair. But in death, you can only stand there, weightless, powerless, and feel it claw at what's left of your soul. I looked at my children, Clara and Michael. Sweet Clara, only 19, her black dress hanging loose on her thin frame, eyes swollen with tears she could no longer hide. Michael, just 17, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might break. He looked at his father with something close to hatred. He looked at the mistress too, though I could tell he wasn't fully sure yet who she was. But suspicion bloomed in his young eyes, and I knew that soon he would piece it all together. And suddenly, I felt grief heavier than any I had carried in life, not for myself, but for them, for the fact that my children's grief was being poisoned by scandal, by betrayal that had no business intruding on this sacred day. They deserved to bury their mother with peace. Instead, they were forced to confront the cracks in the family we had worked so hard to build. The reception after the burial was worse. If the church had been heavy with whispers, the reception hall was thick with them, choking the air. Plates of food were untouched, cups of coffee grown cold, because everyone was too busy leaning into hushed conversations. It must have been years, I heard one woman say. He never loved Evelyn, not really. Poor thing, she must have known. And those last 4 words, felt like daggers. She must have known. I wanted to shout. Yes, I knew. I knew every night he didn't come home, every time he touched me with hands that had already touched her, every lie he wrapped in the softness of his voice. I knew. And I chose silence. Not because I was weak, but because I loved my children more than my pride. But that is the cruelty of betrayal. People see silence as ignorance. They mistake endurance for blindness. They call you a fool, when really you were sacrificing your own sanity to keep your family whole. They will never understand the quiet wars women fight in their own homes, the battles waged behind closed doors, the tears cried into pillows so children never hear. I drifted among the mourners, invisible, aching, as I listened to the woman, the mistress, accept whispered condolences. She smiled faintly, nodded, lowered her eyes as though in genuine mourning. Her act was convincing, too convincing. Some even pitied her, as if she were just another widow in the shadows. My rage deepened with every nod she received, every sympathetic hand that touched her arm. And yet, beneath the rage was something darker, heavier. Shame. Shame that I had allowed it to come to this, that my story was ending not with dignity, but with humiliation. I thought about the nights I stayed awake convincing myself to endure. I thought about how many times I wanted to leave, but stayed. I thought about how I told myself that enduring betrayal quietly was an act of strength. But now, standing in the ashes of my own life, I realized it had cost me everything. The final blow came later that evening. When most of the guests had left and the hall was nearly empty, I saw Thomas walk outside. She followed him, the mistress. My stomach twisted with a fury I could barely contain. I followed, unseen, unwilling to let my story end in silence. They stood under the dim light of a street lamp, shadows stretching long across the pavement. For a moment they didn't speak. Then he reached for her hand.
I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. His hand, the same hand that once held mine through childbirth, through sickness, through every fragile moment of our life together, now held hers with aching tenderness.
Thank you.
She nodded, tears shining in her eyes. I had to. For you. For us. For us. 2 words that slice deeper than any knife. He pulled her close, burying his face in her shoulder. And in that instant, I knew the truth that I had long tried to deny. I was the outsider, even in my own marriage. She was the one who held his heart. And though my body lay in a coffin, though my children were his blood, it was she who carried his soul. I wanted to tear them apart, to scream until the night cracked open and swallowed them whole, but instead I stood frozen, suffocating in silence. This was my legacy. Not love, not loyalty. Betrayal. Carried in whispers and shadows, brought into the light only at my death. But as I drifted away from that scene, from the hall, from the mourners who spoke my name as though it were a cautionary tale, I began to realize something else. Perhaps this was not the end. Perhaps betrayal was not the only truth to be remembered. Because my children, my sweet Clara and Michael, they had seen enough. They would grow up with eyes wide open, unwilling to accept lies dressed as devotion. They would know that silence is not strength when it destroys you from within, and maybe that would be my revenge. Not the kind that screams or claws or burns, but the kind that lingers in memory, shaping futures. Perhaps my betrayal would plant seeds of strength in them, the strength I never allowed myself to embrace. Still, as the night deepened and the whispers of my funeral echoed in my mind, I could not escape the weight of the question that haunted me. Was my silence love, or was it cowardice? The night after my funeral stretched endlessly, heavy with the weight of truths too long buried. I drifted like smoke over my old house, watching through walls and windows as if I could still claim a place there. The rooms echoed with silence, broken only by muffled sobs, the kind that claw their way up from the chest when you've cried so long you no longer have a voice. Clara lay curled in her bed, her face pressed into the same pillow she had carried since childhood. Her shoulders trembled, her grief pouring out in waves. She kept whispering my name, begging for comfort, as though saying it softly might bring me back. And Michael, my sweet boy. He sat rigid at his desk, fists clenched, staring at the floor with fury burning in his young eyes. His grief was raw, jagged, and I feared what it might make of him. Thomas sat in the living room downstairs, hunched over, head in his hands. A bottle of whiskey rested on the table beside him, half empty, the amber liquid glowing faintly in the dim lamplight. He wasn't crying. No, his grief was quieter, almost practiced, like a performance he didn't need to rehearse anymore. But every so often he glanced at his phone, and my rage twisted tighter. I didn't have to guess who he hoped would call. I wanted to scream at him, to shake him, to demand how he could dare think of her on the night he buried me. But I could only hover, powerless, as the man I once loved revealed just how deeply his betrayal ran. It wasn't only the affair. It was the lies layered on lies, the years stolen from me, the dignity stripped, not just from my life, but now from my memory. The whispers at my funeral had already begun painting me as the naive wife, the blind fool, and he, perhaps, would let that story stand, but I would not. I couldn't. Because if death had robbed me of my body, it had not stolen my voice. Not the voice that matters, the voice that echoes in hearts, in truths that rise when secrets finally collapse. I decided then that I would not rest until the story was told, until every mask was ripped away. Days passed. Though time no longer touched me in the way it once did, I watched as Clara and Michael avoided their father, speaking to him only when necessary, their eyes shadowed with suspicion. The mistress, her name, I learned, was Lorraine, appeared more and more in Thomas's life. She called, she visited, she moved with the quiet assurance of someone who knew she no longer had to hide. And Thomas, Thomas let her. One evening, Clara exploded. She had seen Lorraine in the kitchen, laughing softly as she poured wine into a glass Thomas held. My daughter's face twisted in horror, and she screamed, "How could you bring her here? In Mom's house? Have you no shame?" Her voice cracked like thunder through the walls. Michael stormed down the stairs, his fist tight, his eyes blazing. "Is it true?" he shouted at Thomas. "All those nights you were gone. All those lies. You were with her? While Mom was dying?" Thomas faltered, words stumbling from his lips like broken glass. "It's not what you think," he tried. But it was exactly what they thought. They knew it. I knew it. And he knew it. I wanted to reach for them, to cradle my children, to whisper that none of this was their fault, that their mother's silence wasn't weakness, but love. But the only way I could protect them now was to make sure the truth spread further than whispers in dark corners. And so I listened. I watched, and I gathered every crack in his story. Every lie Lorraine spun to justify her presence. Every time Thomas faltered under the weight of his own guilt. Because soon my children would demand more. They would dig deeper. And when they did, I would be there, not in body but in the weight of memory, in the voice that echoed inside their blood. One night, as the storm outside rattled windows and shook the roof, Clara sat at the dining table, papers scattered before her. Letters. Receipts. Notes I had tucked away in drawers that she had found in her search for answers. She read them with trembling hands, and Michael sat beside her, silent, his jaw clenched. "Look at this," Clara whispered. "These dates. He said he was in Chicago. But this receipt." Her voice broke. "He was in town." "At a hotel." Michael's fist slammed against the table. He lied to her, over and over, while she was dying. His voice shook with rage. "I'll never forgive him." And there, in that moment, I saw it. My children, carrying the truth I had kept hidden, no longer victims of lies, but witnesses to them. My silence had been meant to shield them, but perhaps it had only delayed the inevitable. Still, they knew now. And knowing is power. Thomas stumbled into the room then, his face pale when he saw the papers spread out. "Where did you get those?" he demanded. Clara stood, her eyes filled with tears but her voice steady. "From Mom's things." She knew. All along she knew. The silence that followed was suffocating. Thomas lowered his gaze, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of decades had finally broken him. "Yes," he whispered. She knew. The words struck me like lightning. He admitted it. He admitted it out loud where my children could hear. It wasn't whispered gossip anymore, wasn't just suspicion. It was truth. Finally, truth. But instead of relief, I felt something colder. Because even in his confession, there was no remorse in his eyes, only resignation, as though he had accepted that this was the cost of the life he had chosen. Lorraine's life. Michael's voice trembled with fury. "You disgust me. She gave you everything, and you gave her nothing but lies. You don't deserve to call yourself our father." And Thomas, he didn't fight back. He didn't argue. He just lowered his head, silent. That silence was his defeat. And yet for me, it wasn't enough. My soul screamed for more, for justice, for reckoning, for a betrayal so great to leave scars that could never heal. But revenge has a way of taking shape slowly, like ice creeping across water in the dead of winter, and I could feel it forming now. Lorraine may have thought she won, that by stepping into my funeral, by whispering to Thomas in shadows, by sliding into my place at his side, she had claimed victory. But victories built on graves are fragile, and my children would not let her forget. I realized then that my revenge would not come from fury or fire. It would come from truth that lived on in Clara and Michael. Truth that would poison every stolen smile she tried to share with Thomas. every memory they tried to make together. Because betrayal, once named, is never forgotten. It festers. It ruins. And in that, perhaps karma had already begun her work. The storm of truth had broken. And though Thomas tried to patch the wreckage with silence, the damage was irreversible. My children no longer looked at him with trust. They saw him as a stranger who had stolen their childhood's illusion of safety. Every word he spoke sounded like a lie to them, even the ones that might have been true, and that was the cruelest part of betrayal. It doesn't just poison the present, it stains every memory of the past. I watched from the shadows of the house that used to be mine as Clara pulled further away from her father. She stopped eating dinner at the table, spending her nights locked in her room, her sobs muffled by pillows she used to press against her face as a child when frightened of storms. Michael grew harder, angrier. He began coming home late, his fists bruised, his eyes hollow. The family I had fought so desperately to protect was breaking apart before my very eyes, and I could do nothing to hold them together. Lorraine, however, seemed to grow bolder. I saw her more often, her perfume clinging to the walls of my kitchen, her laughter spilling into the rooms that once belonged to me. She moved through my home like an intruder who had decided she belonged. She sat at the table I had polished for years, drank from the glasses I had chosen, touched the curtains I had sewn with my own tired hands. Every moment was an insult, a desecration of the life I had built. One evening, she stood in my living room, her hand resting casually on Thomas's arm, as if it had always been her place. "They'll come around," she whispered to him, her voice silky, confident. "They're just children. They'll get used to it." My fury roared like a storm inside me. Used to it? Used to their mother's memory being trampled beneath her heels? Used to the idea that betrayal could simply be rewritten as love? I wanted to strike her, to shatter the calm mask she wore, but all I could do was watch, burning silently in a world that no longer held my body. But my children, my sweet children, they would not bow so easily. Clara confronted her father late one night. I was there, hovering in the corner as she stood in the doorway, her hand shaking but her voice steady. "I'll never forgive you," she told him. "You brought her here. You let her sit at Mom's funeral. You humiliated her even after death. Do you think I'll ever look at you the same?" Her words sliced deeper than any knife. I saw Thomas's face crumble, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. He lowered his head, his shame heavy, but not heavy enough to keep him from Lorraine's embrace. Michael's rage was louder, less controlled. He punched a hole through his bedroom wall one night, screaming into the silence, cursing his father's name. "You killed her!" he shouted. "You broke her heart before the cancer did. Don't think I don't know it." His voice shook with fury, and though no one answered, the truth of it echoed through every corner of the house. I wanted to reach for him, to cradle his bruised fists in my hands, to tell him that his anger was justified, but that he must not let it devour him. But I could only watch, powerless, my love stretching across a divide no one could see. The mistress's presence deepened the wounds. Each time she arrived, Clara would vanish upstairs. Michael would storm out the door, and the house grew colder, emptier. Thomas tried to pretend it was normal, that life could go on, but the cracks were too wide to ignore. And then came the day Clara found the letters. She had gone through my old desk, searching perhaps for a piece of me, a memory she could hold on to. Instead, she found the letters I had written but never sent. Letters to Thomas, letters that bled with pain and truth. I had poured my heart into them during the nights I couldn't sleep, confessing how I knew, how I had seen him with her, how every lie shattered me a little more. But I never gave them to him. Perhaps I was too afraid. Perhaps I thought silence was safer. Clara read them all. Her tears fell onto the pages, smearing the ink, but she didn't stop. When Michael came into the room, she shoved the letters into his hands. His face darkened as he read, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might break. "He knew," Michael whispered. He knew she knew, and he still kept lying.
That night, my children confronted their father with the letters spread out before him on the table. Clara's voice cracked as she asked, "How could you do this to her? How could you betray her while she was dying?"
Thomas stared at the letters, his hands trembling. For the first time, I saw something like true grief in his eyes, not for me, but for the truth he could no longer bury. I was weak, he said, his voice barely audible. I thought I loved her, but I loved your mother too. I didn't know how to stop.
"Don't you dare say you loved her," Clara snapped, her tears spilling over. "You don't betray someone you love."
You destroyed her, Dad. You destroyed us. Michael's fist slammed against the table. You made her carry this alone. You let her die thinking she wasn't enough. I'll never forgive you. Thomas buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. But no apology, no excuse, no tear could undo what had been revealed. My children saw him for what he was, and nothing could change that.
In that moment, I felt a strange shift inside me. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even peace. But it was justice. For years I had carried the secret of his betrayal, too afraid to speak it aloud. But now, through my letters, through my children, the truth lived on. It was no longer mine to bear alone.
Lorraine tried to hold her place in his life, but the house had turned hostile to her presence. Clara refused to acknowledge her. Michael glared at her with open contempt. Even Thomas began to look weary, as though the cost of his choices was finally sinking in.
I realized then that revenge doesn't always come in the form of fire and fury.
Sometimes revenge is quieter. It's the weight of truth pressing down until those who betrayed you are crushed beneath it. It's the way a name whispered in scandal never fades. It's the memory of a wife scorned living on in her children's defiance.
And yet, even with truth exposed, my heart ached, because I had loved him. I had believed in him. I had built my life around him, only to discover that love doesn't protect you from betrayal. It makes it cut deeper.
But perhaps that was the lesson my children would carry, that love must be honest, or it is nothing at all. As the days stretched into weeks, I watched them grow stronger in their anger, more united in their grief. They clung to each other, finding in their bond what their father had shattered. And I began to feel something I hadn't in years. Not hope exactly, but a fragile kind of vindication, because betrayal may have defined the end of my life, but it would not define theirs. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Like the whisper of wind through leaves, I felt myself drifting, lighter than before. But I wasn't gone yet. Not until every scar of the trail carved its way to its rightful conclusion. Not until the last secret was dragged into the light, because there was still more hidden, and my story was not yet finished. The house that once held laughter and warm dinners became a battleground of silence and resentment. Thomas moved through it like a shadow, weighed down by the judgment in his children's eyes, haunted by the letters Clara had uncovered. Lorraine tried to fill the emptiness, slipping in with her quiet smiles and soft touches, but her presence was like poison seeping into the walls. Every time she crossed the threshold, Clara disappeared into her room, and Michael stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I hovered above it all, aching, watching the family I had built splinter further apart. I thought betrayal had already wrung me dry, but witnessing the aftermath showed me a cruelty I hadn't expected. Betrayal doesn't die with the betrayed. It lingers, festering, infecting everyone it touches. My children carried it now, and I could see how heavy it already sat on their young shoulders. One evening, Clara found her voice again. She sat across from her father at the kitchen table, her hands trembling but her eyes unwavering. "Do you even realize what you did to her?" she asked, her voice low but sharp.
You killed her long before the cancer did. You broke her heart every day. And then you let her die believing she wasn't enough." Thomas's face crumpled, but no apology left his lips. He only stared at his daughter, his silence more damning than any words. Michael didn't bother with words. He hurled his baseball trophy against the wall, shattering it into a spray of shards. "You don't get to sit here and pretend you're our father anymore," he spat. "You disgust me." His voice cracked, and though rage fueled him, I could hear the grief buried beneath it. I longed to gather them in my arms, to tell them I was proud of their courage, that I never wanted them to bear this weight. But I could only hover, helpless, whispering to walls that could not carry my voice. Lorraine thought she had won, that she had finally taken her rightful place. She began moving her belongings into the house, small things at first, a scarf left on a chair, perfume bottles in the bathroom cabinet, a framed photo tucked quietly on a shelf. I burned with fury at every intrusion, but it was my children who fought back. Clara took the photo and threw it into the trash. Michael smashed the perfume bottles against the bathroom tiles, the scent choking the air with defiance. Lorraine tried to soothe Thomas, to whisper that the children would come around, but even he began to look weary. His hand shook when he poured his coffee. His eyes darted toward my photo on the mantelpiece and lingered there, full of a sorrow I could not untangle. Perhaps he mourned me. Perhaps he mourned the man he once was. Or perhaps he mourned only the ruin of his lies. Then came the night that changed everything. Clara had been digging again, unable to let go of the truth she felt still hidden. She opened drawers, searched old files, uncovered papers Thomas thought he had hidden well. That's when she found it. Bank statements, transfers, expensive hotel bills, gifts. Not just evidence of betrayal, but proof that while I was battling cancer, Thomas had been funneling money to Lorraine. Money that should have been spent on my treatments, on our children's future. Clara's hand shook as she read through the numbers, her tears smudging the ink. She carried them to Michael, and together they confronted their father once more. "How could you?" Clara's voice broke as she slammed the papers onto the table. "Mom was dying, and you spent our money on her?" Michael's rage erupted like fire. "You're pathetic. You didn't just cheat. You stole from us, from her. You let her die thinking she was a burden while you wasted everything on that woman." Thomas stared at the papers, his face ashen, his mouth opening and closing with no words to give. For once, his silence wasn't just cowardice. It was confession. Lorraine entered the room then, her heels clicking against the hardwood, her eyes flashing when she saw the papers spread out. "This isn't the time," she began, but Clara cut her off with a scream that shook the walls. "Get out!" Clara's voice tore from her throat, raw and desperate. "This is my mother's house. You don't belong here. You never will." Michael moved toward her, his fist clenched. "If you ever come back here again, I swear." His voice cracked with a fury he couldn't contain. Lorraine faltered for the first time. I saw the mask slip, fear flickering in her eyes. She turned to Thomas, but he didn't move. He didn't defend her. He just sat there, broken, watching his children's fury carve him into pieces. And in that silence, Lorraine understood. She gathered her purse, her hands trembling now, and walked out of the house. The door slammed behind her, and for the first time, the air felt lighter, but it wasn't over. Thomas sat alone at the table, the papers before him, his children's hatred thick in the air. He looked at my photo on the mantel and whispered, "I'm sorry." It was too late. His apology was not for me, it was for himself, for the guilt that gnawed at him, for the ruin he had caused. And though part of me still ached with the love I once bore him, another part reveled in the justice of it. He had lost everything. His children, his dignity, even the woman he betrayed me for had walked away. This was his karma. To sit in the ruins of the life he destroyed, surrounded by the ghosts of what could have been. And as I hovered there, watching my children gather the papers and hold each other, I realized my story was finally ending. Betrayal had defined so much of my life, but it would not define theirs. They had seen the truth. They would carry it forward. They would know never to settle for love that demands silence, never to bear wounds hidden in shadows. I could feel myself growing lighter, as though the anger tethering me to this world was finally unraveling. My children would survive. They would grow strong in the ashes of betrayal, and Thomas would live with the weight of his choices until the end of his days. That was my revenge. Not fire, not fury, but truth, carried in every breath my children took. And as I drifted into the quiet, I whispered my last lesson to them, though they could not hear me. Love is nothing without loyalty. Without truth, it is only betrayal dressed in pretty words. Viewers, if you've stayed with me through my story, I want to thank you. If this touched you, if it made you think of your own scars, your own battles, please like, share, and subscribe. Not for me, but so stories like mine don't vanish into silence. Leave a comment and tell me what you would have done, because no one deserves to be remembered as a fool for love. We deserve to be remembered as human.